This lecture is an introduction to deviance and crime. Here I want to introduce how sociologists approach the topic of deviance and crime. We are also going to offer a brief survey of the main sociological explanations for why deviance and crime occur. Remember the Yanomamo people from last term? That's the indigenous group from the Amazon jungle whose lives were brought to a Western audience by anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon. I read you an excerpt of Chagnon's first impressions of the Yanomamo from his journal. He was overwhelmed by shock and fear at encountering a truly alien culture. But as we now know, social norms can take very different forms. Wearing a suit and tie could be normal in one context, and letting green strands of mucus cover your naked body could be normal in another. In Chagnon's case, he was a deviant within the normative framework of Yanomamo culture. Deviance, then, is any departure from a social norm that gets a negative response. Strictly speaking, from a sociological perspective, nothing is intrinsically deviant. It is relative to our definition of what isn't deviant. As sociologist Howard Becker once said, deviant behavior is behavior that people so label. Which leads us to the issue of crime. On the face of it, crime seems very simple. It's any deviant act that also breaks the law. And laws themselves are simply the norms that a society has chosen to regulate through a legal code. Take theft, for instance, which we see here. We know it's wrong. We accept that it's illegal. Theft seems pretty straightforward as a crime. But crime, just like deviance, is nothing natural. Instead, it is the result of social definitions that are rooted in time and place and which can change quite dramatically. As history shows us, Jesus was considered a criminal in his time, as was Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. I mentioned Adolf Eichmann in last week's lecture, a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, and in fact, the principal architect of the Nazi death camp system. He was executed for war crimes, and his name will forever be associated with gross abuses of human rights. However, during the reign of the Third Reich, Eichmann was widely admired in Germany and carried out policies that were perfectly legal at the time. We can use the term sanctions to refer to the spectrum of social responses to deviance and crime. At one end of the spectrum, we have informal sanctions. An example might be the shame you might be made to feel for acting strangely in public, or how someone defined by others as weird in a secondary school setting would be stigmatized by fellow students. At the other end of the spectrum, we have formal sanctions, as we can see, for instance, in the provisions of the Criminal Code. From a sociological perspective, what seems to determine how severely a society responds to deviance and crime? One issue is perceived harmfulness, which in turn is linked to the degree of public consensus about a particular crime or deviant behavior. The key word here is perceived. Based on the scientific evidence, alcohol is much more harmful than marijuana, yet weed only became legal in May 2018. So, from a sociological perspective, we have to stand back and look at the dividing line between normal and deviant, not as an outgrowth of common sense, but as the result of an ongoing social contestation about what we see as good and what we see as bad. Let's go back to the idea of public consensus. Here, history is a great teacher. in showing us how the social consensus can change. You may not know this, but legal cocaine was once widely available in North America. As for marijuana, the social consensus on weed has changed rapidly from negative to positive. Interestingly, the Liberal MP with the job of coming up with a blueprint for marijuana legalization was until recently Toronto's chief of police. There are even social behaviors that are simultaneously normative and deviant, depending on your point of view. For instance, binge drinking on campus at Canadian universities and colleges is very common. Almost 1/3 of students say they drink heavily at least once a month. From the perspective of the norms of an academic setting, this is deviant. However, looked at from the angle of the peer culture at university and college campuses, to binge drink is to conform to the social norms. We are going to turn our attention now to an overview of sociological theories about deviance and crime. What are the factors that result in some people or groups going over the line into deviance or crime and not others? Here, we're going to highlight some key ideas from functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. First, functionalism. As we know, functionalists are mainly concerned about the relationship between social consensus and social stability. And it was Emile Durkheim, one of the early sociologists, who actually pointed out that deviance and crime are beneficial to society because they serve the positive function of clarifying where the boundaries are between the good and the bad. So the rule breakers help by showing the rest of us where the boundaries are and what the consequences will be if we fall out of line. This is what sociologists call the boundary maintenance function of deviance. The second idea from functionalist Robert Merton is what he called strain theory. Basically, if you are poor and your society tells everyone that your life is only worthwhile if you are rich, there is strain between that ideal and your lack of ability to achieve it. So, criminal behavior, theft for instance, would be one way to resolve that strain. Looking at the chart here, if you accept the cultural goal of material success, but reject the normal, legit means of achieving that, crime would be a form of innovation. Now we turn to conflict theory, which examines deviance and crime within the context of social and political inequality. One of the ideas here is that the more powerful groups in society are more able to impose deviant labels on those who are less powerful or who challenge the social order. Just look at the rate of incarceration of Indigenous peoples in Canada. 4% of the population, but over 20% of those in prison. Peeling back the layers, part of the explanation has to do with widespread poverty in the Indigenous population. Part of it is due to equally widespread discrimination by non-Aboriginal Canadians, by the court system, and by the police. Symbolic interactionism, for its part, has taken its close focus on social interaction and meaning to look at, in the case of crime, how people learn criminal behavior and criminal social roles. According to this perspective, the subculture of a gang, for instance, creates a social context where members can learn criminal behavior. In addition, if someone is in a lot of social environments where they are exposed to criminal behavior or to positive attitudes about crime, the likelihood is greater that they will engage in criminal behavior themselves. For both of these reasons, you can understand why prisons fail to rehabilitate a lot of career criminals. Being locked up for a long time with like-minded individuals is a great opportunity to enhance one's criminal skill set. Symbolic interactionists aren't just interested in how people learn to be deviants or criminals, but also the role that society plays in defining some behaviors as deviant and others as normal. As the textbook points out, if you are labeled a delinquent, for instance, by police or school authorities, that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which we know about from last term. Thanks for listening in to this lecture.